As always, it is great to be here at Highlands worshiping with all of you. If you are visiting us this morning, we want to thank you for choosing to be here this morning, and we hope that we are able to get to know you and to meet you after services. So, when I was growing up, superheroes, as they are today, but superheroes were a really big thing, right? I remember the first time I ever watched the Spider-Man cartoon, which was my favorite thing. Saturday mornings, I'd get up and I would watch Spider-Man, and it was the coolest thing to me. And we would go to school, in elementary school, we would all go to the lunchroom, and we would show off, our Spider-Man or our Batman lunchboxes, or our backpacks, or I had some Batman socks that had little capes on the back that I thought were really neat. We loved superheroes. They don't groan like that. They were cool. All right, they were cool. We loved superheroes. Superheroes were a huge thing. Comic books, as I grew older, were a big part of my life. Every Wednesday, comic books were released, and so I would go to the store and get the books I read, and I spent probably way too much time reading comic books growing up. But for me, as much as I would talk with my friends at school about the heroes that we liked, whether it was Spider-Man or Iron Man or Batman or whatever man it was, as much as we talked about that, I had my own set of heroes that I didn't really have in common with them. Because the way that I was raised in my family, I had biblical superheroes that I grew up just as obsessed with, just as much as reading about them and thinking about them. I would think about Joshua and him leading the children of Israel to defeat Jericho. I would think about Elisha and Elijah and the amazing feats that they accomplished. And I would think about Gideon and leading this army that was so small and so minuscule and still being able to defeat a huge enemy. But I think the greatest hero, biblical hero for me growing up, was Samson. And I chose this picture because this was the picture that this will tell you what kind of Bible nerd I was. I had this as a poster on my wall, right? Which is probably why I was a little less popular than some of the other kids. But this was on my wall in my room because to me, Samson was the greatest superhero. Like, he was awesome. He did these amazing, amazing things. And we would talk about him and we would have classes about him. And so this week, I've been kind of thinking about Samson. And so we're going to talk about him a little bit today. So open up to Judges chapter 13. Judges 13, 1 through 5. And we're going to read these together. It said, "The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines for 40 years. Now let's pause there. The Israelites have this pattern. You know, they are God's chosen people, but we see throughout the Old Testament that they have a pattern of constantly disappointing God, falling away from God, betraying God, and so then God removes his protection from them, and they typically end up being conquered by somebody else. So that's what happens here. So they are conquered by the Philistines for 40 years. And then it says there was a certain man from Zorah, from the family of Dan, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was unable to conceive and had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, 'It is true that you are unable to conceive and have no children, but you will conceive and give birth to a son. Now please be careful not to drink wine or beer or eat anything unclean, for indeed you will conceive and give birth to a son. You must never cut his hair, because the boy will be a Nazirite to God from birth, and he will begin to save Israel from the power of the Philistines.'" So as we think about superheroes this morning, there's 4 things that every superhero has or every superhero needs. Number 1, they have to have an origin story. And Samson has a pretty awesome origin story. An angel comes to his mom, which may sound familiar, and says, "Hey, you can't have a kid. You've never had a kid, but guess what? You're going to have a kid." And she does. So Samson has a cool origin story, but then superheroes also need a people to protect and an enemy to fight. And here we see that. In the beginning of this passage, it sets the scene that the Israelites are Samson's people and that the Philistines are the enemy. So Samson's purpose is to protect the Israelites from the Philistines. But then also heroes need a power that makes them unique, right? Superheroes aren't so super if they can just do things that I can do, right? The whole point of me opening up a comic book is for me to be able to immerse myself in a world and immerse myself in a character that does things that I can't do in real life. And Samson has that. We see as we read, and we're going to talk about these in a minute, but we see as we read that Samson has amazing strength and an amazing prowess in battle. He is a leader, and he is someone who is feared by the Philistines. But then the last thing that heroes need is a weakness. Every hero has to have a vulnerability, because if they're not vulnerable, what's the point? If there's no risk, then what's the point? Superman has kryptonite. Batman, we can argue about what his weaknesses is, but I think it tends to be women. But whatever you think it might be, which is going to be true here as well. But for Samson, what we read is that, and what we will see later, is that his hair is his weakness, that his power comes from his long hair, and so by removing that long hair, you remove his power. So every hero needs these things, but let's talk about, before we move on, what it means to be a Nazirite. So the word Nazirite is from the Hebrew word Nazir, and it means to be consecrated or separated. You see, someone who was taking the Nazirite vow, this is a vow that you would take, and someone who was taking that vow, they would promise to never drink strong drink or defile themselves through eating something that was unclean. They would also promise to never cut their hair. This isn't talked about in Scripture, but many people who took the Nazirite vow would also never clip their fingernails or toenails. Basically, the idea is that they would never defile themselves or even really change their appearance. And their hair was kind of the most important part, because their hair served as a symbol to the world that they belonged to God. So for Samson, his long hair that has never been cut served as a symbol and a reminder so that everyone around him would know that his life had been dedicated to God. And you see, we're kind of that way too. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, as we talk about being consecrated and set apart, it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." You see, what's cool about Samson, I can read about Superman or Batman, but Batman just has a lot of money and a bunch of cool toys, and that's probably never going to be me, right? Superman can fly and do all these crazy things, and that's never going to be me. He's not even human. He's an alien. But with Samson, we're a whole lot more like him than we might think. Because just as Samson was consecrated and set apart and separated, dedicated to God, we too, who have chosen to follow Christ, have been set apart and dedicated. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So in exchange for this vow, by making this vow to God, Samson was given a gift. God granted Samson inhuman strength in exchange for this commitment and this vow that he made. And he was strong. Like really strong. He killed a lion with his bare hands. We read about him defeating an entire Philistine army with only the jawbone of a donkey. He toppled a Philistine temple by just pushing on the columns. Samson was amazing. And that was a gift that was given to him in exchange for this vow. But we too have been given a gift in exchange for our commitment. In Matthew chapter 17, the disciples are speaking with Jesus, and basically some of the disciples had been trying to cast out demons and had been failing. They had tried to cast out a demon and it didn't work, and they asked Jesus, "Why didn't this work?" And this is what Jesus says. He says, "Because of your little faith," he told them. "For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Now, I don't suggest that you go and try to push a mountain after lunch today, although I don't know where you would find a mountain here. But the point is that we are different. That when we are baptized into the body of Christ and when we receive the Holy Spirit, we become something different. And as Christians, our lives work differently. And we have been given a power. And it may not even be a power that we fully understand, but we too have been given a gift in exchange for our commitment and our vow. But here's the problem with superheroes. They're not perfect. They all have weaknesses, and Samson had a pretty major weakness. See, it really wasn't his hair, although that was physically what his weakness was. But Samson's weakness was something a little more normal. In Judges chapter 16, we read about Samson basically right after a battle. He meets a Philistine woman, and he falls in love with her. Now remember, the Philistines are the enemy. The Philistines are the one that he was literally brought into the world to fight the Philistines. He's been spending his whole life fighting them, And here he is, he's fallen in love with a Philistine woman. And she, Delilah, would be his downfall. She would pretty much from the beginning begin to try to trick him into telling her how he could be defeated. And what's crazy is she tried several times and he would lie. She would say, Samson, where does your strength come from? And he would lie to her, and then she would try to have him attacked and killed, and it would fail. And you would think after the first time he would go, hey, maybe this isn't the girl I should be hanging out with. But that didn't happen. Guys we're not always the brightest when it comes to women, and so he tries again, right? And so again she says, hey, where does your strength come from? And he tells her a lie, and she has him attacked, and it fails. And finally, pretty much out of exasperation, Samson says, listen, my strength comes from my hair. If you cut my hair, my vow will be broken, and I'll be like just anybody else. And so that's what happens. Delilah waits until Samson is asleep. She has his hair cut. She brings in a group of Philistines to attack him, and they take him captive, and our hero has fallen. See, Samson's weakness, it wasn't really his hair. His weakness was that even though he was set apart and separated, even though he was consecrated and had taken this Nazirite vow, he still couldn't stay away from being a part of the world. You know, what happens a lot of times when we are different is we spend a lot of time longing to just be like everybody else. And so Samson, as amazing as he was, as awesome as he was, he couldn't resist the temptation to be a part of the normal world. And so he gave in to that. And so I think about that with us. You see, in Acts chapter 2, we see a description of the church, of the early church. And it describes a group of people who are living lives that are totally different than everyone else around them. It describes a group of people who are living in community and worshiping in community and using their money differently and using their time differently and using their housing differently. It describes a group of people who, just by the way they live, are having an amazing, major impact on their communities. People know who they are because they're different, and they can see the difference, and they can feel the difference, and they talk differently and act differently and live differently. We see a church that has a huge influence just by the way they live their lives. And then I think about my life today, and I wonder, am I really that different from the rest of the world? Do I live my life any differently? Do I really spend my money any differently? Do I live in community any differently? Do I interact with my community any differently than everybody else? You see, I think what happens is, even though we know that we have been set apart, even though we know that we have been consecrated and separated for Christ, we see the world around us, and we just want to be a part of that. You see, in John 15, verse 19, Jesus said this, "If you were of the world would love you as its own. However, because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of it, the world hates you." Now, we could get really focused on that part about the world hating us, and that could get really depressing really quick. But here's the part that I think is really important. When we choose to dedicate our lives to Christ, we are consecrated and separated in a way that means that this world is not our home anymore. We are sojourners, we are foreigners here, that we are not really of this world. Our allegiance is not here, it is in heaven. And the thing about being a foreigner, I lived in the Dominican Republic for several years. Even beyond just the color of my skin, it was very obvious when I walked around in the Dominican that I wasn't from there, right? Number one, I came from a country where we have a lot more money than the average citizen does there. So it was obvious by my clothes and the car I drove and everything that I was different, the food that I ate and the way that I talked. And it was just clear to people around me in the Dominican that I was a foreigner, that I was different. Even if you took a person of Dominican descent who was raised in the States and took them to the Dominican, the local Dominicans there would be able to tell in an instant that that person wasn't born in the Dominican Republic. Because when you are a foreigner in a foreign land, it's noticeable. So when people look at us, if we are truly foreigners, if this world is truly not our home, if we are truly not of this world, when people look at us, do they see a difference? Can they tell that something is different? When they look at the way we live our lives and they hear the way we talk and when they see the way that we interact with people, can they tell that something's different? Most of you know, for the last several months, I have had the pleasure of working at Chick-fil-A, and we have several of our members here who also work at Chick-fil-A. And so I have had the pleasure of serving under Torrance, who is our kitchen manager. And so the cool thing about being at Chick-fil-A is it's the first time I've really had an opportunity to interact with members of our congregation outside of the scope of me being their minister, right? So at Chick-fil-A, I'm not Torrance's minister. I'm not the youth minister. I'm just someone who works under Torrance. And you know what I've learned? By spending time with people who work under him and who are around him, and he's probably going to be mad at me that I'm talking about this, but I had a conversation with one of my coworkers, and they were talking about Torrance. Everybody calls him T, which I struggled with at first, but we're getting there. And I just asked him. I said, what kind of manager is Torrance? Like, do you like working under him? And he said, I've worked at McDonald's, I've worked at several other places, but I've never had a manager like Torrance. He holds us accountable. He's tough, but he's fair and he's kind, and the way that he speaks to us is different than the way that our other managers speak to us. You see, people can tell when you're different. People can tell that there's something that's different about you, and that's kind of how it's supposed to work, right? People should notice that the way we speak to them, the way that we interact with our communities, that the way that we carry ourselves in our lives, even the fact that we seem to have some joy that most people don't have, people should notice that. And I think about how we operate as churches, as congregations. Within religious society as a whole, there is a big push to do what we call normalize. It's called being seeker-friendly, and there has been a big push to kind of make little changes and little tweaks to maybe make people who didn't grow up in the church a little more comfortable. And I think in general that's a good thing, but what happens is we start taking the name of Christ off of things. And we start trying to take away little things to make people more comfortable. And what happens is eventually we look around and we realize that we look just like everybody else. And that the things we do aren't really different than anybody else. And nobody can really tell who we are anymore. And more importantly, nobody can really know who we serve anymore, because we've gotten so concerned about fitting in that we've completely missed the point that we were never meant to fit in, but we were meant by our lives to bring glory and honor and point people to Christ. And I think for myself, and maybe for you this morning. Now, I grew up in high school, all I wanted was to fit in with everybody else. And one of the freeing things about being a Christian is that's not really what I have to worry about anymore. Now I just focus on living my life the way that Christ has showed us how to live it. And the rest will fall into place. And so this morning I ask you, have you gotten caught up? Have we gotten caught up in this mindset of wanting to be like everybody else? Have we made sacrifices in our lives that maybe felt like they weren't a big deal, but have caused us to take away the things that make us different, to take away the things that symbolize the commitment we've made to Christ, and therefore we've broken our vows too? See, the thing, just like Samson, when his hair was cut, he lost that connection with God, and God took that strength away. And I wonder sometimes if we find ourselves kind of banging our head against the wall when it comes to trying to make a difference and to do ministry. I wonder if maybe one of the reasons why I struggle trying to make a difference is because I've cut my spiritual hair off. And I've tried so hard to be like everybody else that now, because I'm not any different, I can't have the same impact. I don't point people to Christ like I used to, and so my connection's kind of been lost too. But the beautiful thing is, with Samson and with us, there's always a way back. Hair can be regrown. We see with Samson, after he is captured, he is taken to one of the Philistine temples, and they decide to throw a big party and show him off. Because you realize that the Philistines had been fighting Samson for years, and he had always defeated them, and so now they've got him, they have the opportunity, and they want to show the world that they've finally beaten Samson, and so they chain him up between two pillars, and they begin to have this party. And Samson has this moment where he prays to God. And he essentially says, God, return to me again. And in that moment, his strength is returned, and he pulls the pillars down, and in one final act of defiance against the Philistines, he collapses the entire temple. And for us, this morning, maybe you look at your life, you look in the mirror, and what you see isn't really that different from the world around you. But we, each and every one of us, have an opportunity today and every day to return to Christ and live our lives the way that He has called us to. And while we will be different, and the way we live our lives may make people uncomfortable, and the way we talk about Christ may make people uncomfortable. It may make people angry. Remember, Jesus said the world will hate you because you're not of the world. That's going to happen. But my approval doesn't come from them. My reward doesn't come from them. My peace and my joy doesn't come from the world. It comes from Christ. And so this morning, if you find yourself in that place, I encourage you and I implore you to make a decision today and every day to live your life as a Nazirite, consecrated and separated and dedicated to God. And I believe that we as a church have an opportunity to allow God to use us through the way we live our lives to completely change Lakeland and to change this country and to change this world, because that's what God has called us to. Let's close with this. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul makes this statement. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation. I pray, and I think a lot of us pray, that we can be a church that is different, that is set apart, that people will notice that something is different and not go, oh, wow, that's really cool that you do that differently, but will be able to see Christ through the way we live our lives. I pray that we are a church that is unapologetically, unequivocally Christian, and that everything we do as a body and as individuals will point to Jesus. Because that is our origin story. That is why we are here. This morning, if you find yourself struggling as a Christian to really feel different or feel that connection to Christ, or maybe there's a sin in your life that you struggle with that has caused you to maybe step away from the path that Christ has laid before you, there's a chance today to make a decision to turn that around. You can be reconsecrated. You can renew that vow. And this morning, if you are struggling in that way or any way, we would love to pray with you, to speak with you, to walk beside you as you seek to turn in the direction that God is trying to point you. And if you're not a Christian this morning, I pray that you know that you have a God who loves you, and He loves you so much that He sent His Son to die for you so that you can live this amazing, separated, consecrated life and receive your reward. Whatever your needs may be, will you please come as we stand and as we sing?
Salvation belongs to our God.